You're now listening to the Arsenal Therapy Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Arsenal Therapy Podcast. Today I've got a very, very special guest. His name is Harvey Gratian. You may have seen him on YouTube. He does some phenomenal tactical breakdown content. Harvey, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for having me on. I think I'm excited today just to chat about Riccardo Calafiori, our weird and wonderful Italian.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you haven't guessed, that's the topic of today's video. We are going to dive into Calafiori, really look at his strengths, what has really set him apart this season, apart from fitness, and why he is so important to Arsenal. So first up, we're going to have a look at a quote from Mikel Arteta. This is one that I've seen Harvey share before in one of his videos, and I think it really sums up Calafiori. This came just after the United game. And for me, I don't know about you, but this is one that I just really loved. He talks about him being unpredictable. And one of the key things that I've highlighted here, he does things in and around your box, in the middle, in the opposition's box, and it's very difficult to predict. And that's why he's so happy with him. So talk to me about this, because we keep hearing about Mikel restricting players. But if there's one thing Mikel does not do, it is restrict Calafiori. This is a player that's given freedom to roam and really showcase the exceptional talents he has on the football pitch.
Yeah, I think, first of all, we should say, let's not forget, this role that we're seeing Calafiori in at the moment was initially played by Takehiro Tomiyasu, this sort of troublemaker from left back, which is allowed to go inside, outside, up and down. And I think it's an idea from left back that Arteta has probably been toying with for a while. But back to the idea of, I guess the topic is risk or caution and Arteta, isn't it? And I think it is a really nuanced debate, but the free rein that we've seen him giving Calafiori this season, this sort of unapologetic freedom that he gets, I think it reminds you just as much that if you take Arteta out of it for a second, it's just as much the players that are on the pitch. They're the guys making these split second decisions, because I think sometimes it's more about just how a player naturally behaves. And I don't think there's anything a manager can really do to curb that at some points. I think a couple of nice examples. There was one when we were away at Anfield, and there was a 50-50 in the middle of the pitch between Gyokeres and Van Dijk. And it's one of those moments where if we lose the ball, as we actually did, Van Dijk steps in and I think Gyokeres gets a yellow card, and the ball's turned over, you're looking at a really dangerous transition towards our own goal. But if you watch Calafiori, it's around the 60th, 65th minute mark. He's trying to sneak a step the other way, and it's that sort of front-footedness, and it's those kind of natural behaviours and tendencies that I think Calafiori's showing on the pitch this season, being allowed to show on the pitch this season. And that quote that you showed, how Arteta speaks about the energies that he brings, the unpredictabilities, but I think it's that kind of those more intangible things that he gives to the side that have these really interesting tactical ripple effects that I'm sure we're going to get onto. But I think it's important to note that it is the players making these decisions on the pitch, and Calafiori, I think, is such an interesting energy to have in and around the team, and a really much needed one, I think, too.
Yeah, and this is a position we see him in quite often, is taking up the kind of inverted midfield role, coming in from left back. But what's unusual is he's not inverting as a left back. He's gone into the right side of midfield here. And that is echoed if you look at Calafiori's touch map. He's all over the park. And you've just mentioned players making decisions themselves. This is something that I'm really, really glad you've just said, because it's not me going on about it again. So I often say on this show that I feel that tactics are over-indexed in the modern game, that you have a system that gives you an identity, and that's what keeps you playing in a certain way that you keep coming back to. That's your structure, your base. That's your kind of your safety blanket, that you know your structure, you know where people stand, but ultimately it's about decisions players make on the pitch. And Calafiori is a prime example of that. And this touch map really highlights that. He's a player for me that knows where to go in a game. He fills it out. He understands what's happening. And you mentioned the Liverpool game, because it's something that I am going to touch on. But there were a few examples in that game. There was one down the touchline where the ball comes in and he's very quick on Salah. He goes in, he wins that ball, and he gets us down the line. In that game, he was very, very switched on defensively, but it showed that front-footed defending. Talk to me a bit about kind of that risk, that, I guess, player understanding and that freedom that every player naturally has to go and do the things that they want to or they think the game requires.
Yeah, well, I think certainly the platforming, if we want to use that that word, from Arteta is important. But if we want to try and tie down what the kind of role is that he's playing, this troublemaking role from left back this season, it's essentially hunting and roaming for gaps and advantages around that pairing of Rice and Zubimendi, who are sort of equally flexible in how they like to change their heights and the angles that they play at. And I think, well, what I would like to say about Calafiori, I guess, is that there's a lot of, maybe, like you said yourself, it's over indexed, I think, how he's just presented at times, I think, through no mistake from anyone in particular, as this kind of chaos man. And I think that takes away from a lot of the intelligence that you see. Yes, there's sort of the sheer quantity of off-ball movements. If you just it's fascinating if you just watch him and him alone in a game, and all the different weird and wonderful directions that he's moving. But the timing that you'll see him make on those diagonal darts that he makes, as Zubimendi will come into the back line and play that cutter into him, and he sort of takes it on in his momentum, in his stride. And there's that intelligence and that IQ that he's not just popping up in these random places for no good reason. And I think there's a lot of strings to his bow as an attacking threat too, other than just being a bit random. Whether it's sort of a first touch flick or a give and go, or how he opens up his hips and swivels and drives on the inside. I think some of the striking of the ball around the box, again, is often at sort of places or passes. I think we've seen that Trivela pass to Saka often this season, or, as I know you wanted to get onto, the assist for Gyokeres against Leeds. These sort of passes or dribbles that he goes on, another player would often need one or two touches to set them up. And for Calafiori, it's not what makes him unstoppable necessarily, but more irrepressible, that kind of energy that he gives to the team, that as an opposition you can't really keep him down, even if those levels of freedom change from game to game. But yeah, Calafiori for me, it's the platforming from Arteta has been important, and from there it's go and show the team the ideas, the brains, the uniqueness that you bring on the pitch from there.
Yeah, yeah, you've mentioned the Trivelas, the pass for Gyokeres for the goal against Leeds, the position, and you look at his pass map, it is all over the place. And look at the starting position of some of these passes as well. That's what's really interesting. It's not just the passes themselves, the direction that they're going in, the intent, but it's where he's receiving the ball, where he's making his impact. And you can see right over to the right-hand side of the pitch, Calafiori is on the ball. And I think sometimes he is a player, he kind of puts out a fire. Sometimes he goes and gets involved in the attack when it's required. But just on the Leeds pass, because that was one, it's so simple. This is such a simple ball over the top. Ball comes into him from Madueke, first time, but it's that understanding and that knowledge of where his teammates are. But we have seen Arsenal play this ball more. Arsenal ranked 6th for long passes in the league this season. So do you think players like Calafiori are a big reason because of that? Because they've got the freedom to suss out what's needed in a game as opposed to playing within a structure as is widely reported?
I think certainly in this example, if you watch this example in a clip, the rotation with Declan Rice here is part of the reason why, and this is no stray or negative about Myles Lewis-Skelly. I think Arteta said it well himself a week or two ago. It's just sometimes we want to do different things with different positions. And in this example here, you have how Rice still has lots of freedom operating from, I guess, that starting point in that deeper left pivot. And Calafiori, as he sort of arrives here, he drifts into this position that he's playing this pass from a central area, initially stacking on top of Zubimendi. And it allows Rice to arrive a bit higher. And Calafiori playing in that pocket is actually using the space and the gravity that Rice has created with that first off-ball run. And he's scanning, he's constantly probing and looking over the top, and he strikes up, I think, connections with players very easily. In that Leeds game, we saw how well he associated and combined with Madueke. I think that was one of those real positives for that left wing sample for Madueke. And I think for Gyokeres himself, I don't think Gyokeres was as cottoned on to that ball in behind as Calafiori was. And I think it just shows you that there are spaces, whether that's in behind or whether that's a little pocket to play in. There are spaces always, but sometimes you need to be backpedaling like Calafiori was there, constantly on the move, constantly scanning, ready to play at these weird angles. And that's how you find them. And Calafiori, whether it's sort of swapping in and out with Rice or stacking on top of Zubimendi, these movements are just so important. And I think it's not something necessarily that should have come up as something new this season. I think some of the reasons why we saw maybe a more positionally restrained version of Calafiori last season, certainly the fitness issues are one, and how many actions you want him making, because there was a little fitness scare, isn't there? Wasn't there in pre-season against Newcastle? He went flying in on Joe Linton, I think it was, and he ended up being subbed off with what we thought was a more serious injury than it was. But if you just watch in that passage how many actions he is put through in a game, he's not just flying into Joe Linton, but he's sort of shifting side to side one way and the next, giving and going. And I think getting into the place that he is now, clearly in a much happier touchwood position with his body and the sort of durability aspect, we can give this more unrestrained role, which Arteta, I think, has always had in his sights a bit more often.
Yeah, and we talk about being unrestrained. Here's an example of him against Forest. You can see all over the pitch, moving with freedom. You can see that his touch map is wild. It's one of those, the heat map. He was all over the place. This was one of his best games recently. Although he's been fantastic, he's been one of our best players this season. I would argue one of the best players in the Premier League this season. But against West Ham, he just played with such a freedom that it was almost like he was carefree, having a kick about with his mates, and it showed the sheer talent level that he has. However, you look at the Liverpool game by contrast, and you look at where he played in that game, it showed his ability to stay in shape, to hold width, have that discipline, and not go roaming, because the game required him to shut out Mo Salah. And again, this is something that I think is kind of misreported about Calafiori, and a lot of it comes from our own fan base, in that people say he can't defend, he's beaten too easily. But my argument is always, if a player goes forward and wins the ball 9 times, I'm more than happy with him losing it 1 or 2 times and having Saliba or Gabriel and Raya behind them to mop it up. I would rather those 9 challenges that go forward and get us on the front foot. But what are your thoughts on his just front-footed play versus his defensive actions? Because it is a topic for debate within the Arsenal fan base.
I would say, I mean, I spoke in that little anecdote, if you wanted to call that, at the beginning, of players' sort of behaviours or tendencies, and how he's always someone that's going to try and steal a yard ahead of the ball instead of thinking about what if we lose it. Or alternatively, if he's got a couple of pressers pressing him, he's going to take a touch towards them instead of think to hit the channel or move it backward. I would say for that Liverpool game in particular, I mean, it showed the key things that he has still to improve on and did improve on in that game. I think defensively for Calafiori, it's always been about picking the right battles for the situation, because we know he's front footed. We know in the counter press, he's such a weapon. I think him and Zubimendi, alongside players like Declan Rice, have been so important for that counter press, which we might speak about a little bit later. But in terms of the 1v1s, which I guess is kind of more the flashcard that fans speak about when they see a player potentially get beat or look a bit more lost, it's always about the timing, I think, of when to approach, because there's nothing wrong with being aggressive and wanting to be tight to your man. But if you get that timing wrong, that's when you get spun. That's when you look a bit flat-footed. As I mean, there have been a couple of times this season, not when he was forced to be a bit more switched on against Mo Salah and Liverpool. But I remember Dan and Doy for Nottingham Forest, who, I mean, on the ball, Calafiori was pulling him all over the place in that sort of really poor Forest man-to-man press. But he got spun and there was a give and go against him there. And then it's about the angles that he approaches the attacker 1v1 in. Against Salah, he was absolutely brilliant at this. I think it's all about timing, engagement, and angles for Calafiori, and probably just volume and reps. He's not a poor defender. He's actually a very, very good defender. I think in terms of the 1v1 play that, again, becomes that flashcard against him at some point, it's more that I think over the years, as maybe the injuries have piled up and he's also got a bit heavier, certainly in the upper body, he might have lost a little bit of that side-to-side shuffle or burst. But I think how open he is, and this speaks on the ball as well. You see him playing at so many different angles. He's still got that ability to spring either way. And that game against Salah, it showed the importance of, if he does get turned, not trying to overcompensate. I think in previous years, or previous times, as soon as Calafiori has got beat, suddenly he's diving in, suddenly he's overcompensating. And I think against Salah, that wasn't the case. There was one example that I distinctly remember of Salah twisting and turning him, and Calafiori's getting in really awkward positions, but he sort of keeps a through line in his body deliberately up straight and doesn't. And in the end, Gabriel helps him, but it's that not overcompensating. And other than that, the timing and the engagement and the arrivals, the anticipation, that's what Calafiori can improve on, I think, defensively.
Yeah, it's interesting because the arrivals is such a strength in his attacking game, but it's that thing that if he's not switched on, he can be spun and he can be turned and get a yellow card very easily. Interestingly, we saw it at Forest away last year. First minute of the game, he picked up a yellow card because he got spun down the line and he pulls his man down. I thought it was a harsh yellow given that we were a minute into the game, but here we are. Interestingly, as well, though, you mentioned him getting more top heavy. He's got huge shoulders, so that side to side shuffle is definitely something. You've got a lot of weight to shift on top just for the sheer breadth of his shoulders. However, we've seen this season already how quick his feet are. But one question I did have for you on that is, for me, we never saw Calafiori last year. I didn't know what he looked like in an Arsenal shirt match fit. I never felt he got to that point, and he said that himself. Do you think this is him starting to get match fit now to the point that we're starting to learn who he is and he's starting to learn the league because he's actually experiencing it?
I think quite possibly. I would say, I mean, before I continue with that, just you were speaking about the yellow card that he got early away to Forest last year. The same happened in the second half against Brian Mbeumo for United. And if you watch how he goes in on Mbeumo, it's launched up towards Mbeumo from a goal kick. And Calafiori, when we're talking about the angles that he comes in at, it's how Mbeumo wants to spin down the line, and instead of blocking that angle and ushering him, or not ushering down the line, staying on that outside line, Calafiori comes in on the inside. That's when the ball goes over the top of his head, and that's when Mbeumo can spin him. So that's an example of him still, I think, having to learn just the quality of these wingers that he's coming up against week in, week out. And I would say, in terms of Calafiori this season, I think the ideas and sort of the brains and the freshness that he gave to the side, that was evident last year. But I think it's almost a sigh of relief this year that he's still that breath of fresh air on the team. Mikel's still speaking about him in the same way, and we're giving him, again, it's no shade on Myles Lewis-Skelly, because it's just about how you want to do things with different roles. And I think defensively, indirectly, Calafiori is a big positive on the team because it keeps Rice lower more often, protecting. And that's another thing that's often missed out. But I think, yeah, we're seeing a Calafiori now who's not just playing with a real confidence and a swagger, but I mean, 7 games and he's played at least 70 minutes pretty much in all of them. he's one of the first names on the team sheet for how we set up at the moment. Even against West Ham, we actually, certainly as soon as Zubimendi came on for Ødegaard, Rice actually again played a little bit of a higher role, and Calafiori was taking more deeper touches. Again, he was everywhere and he was in and out and shuffling and rotating with Rice. But that would typically have been more of a Myles Lewis-Skelly zone to be in, pinching in next to Zubimendi in the pivot, but it was still a role that allowed Calafiori to express himself all over the pitch. So I think he's one of the first names on the team sheet this season. He's full of confidence. He looks more durable, again, touch wood, and we're getting the best out of him. I said before on my channel that if we can get 30 games of not necessarily him playing, but being available this season in the Premier League, that's probably as significant a yardstick for success as you can get. And I don't think that's overstating the importance of having this player, this kind of player and profile available to us consistently throughout the year.
Yeah, well, I want to park the thought on Declan Rice for a second because I do want to touch on that. You've kind of led me into a question that I was going to ask you, but I do want to talk about his relationship with Zubimendi, which you've also mentioned. And this is an example from the West Ham game that ultimately leads to Calafiori hitting the post. But you can see the two of them in the middle here. You can see again where Calafiori comes to receive it, right in the center of the park. But throughout this move, what's really interesting is how close him and Zubimendi remain and they move across the pitch. And this touch is crucial in the middle because he's so close to losing it. But Zubimendi and Calafiori are scanners. Everything about them is looking for what's next. And the ball goes right across the pitch. You can see right, nearly every player is involved in this. But Calafiori's movement, this just really showed how kind of unpredictable he is and how difficult it is to pick him up. I did a show with Adrian Clark in the summer and I described him as our Trent. Very different players, but you can't man mark a fullback. You can't shut a fullback out of the game, and it gives you that wild card. But even at this point, Calafiori's standing still. Next minute, he sees an opportunity. He sees that ball about to break, and he's alive to it. He's the first to it. But throughout everything, you look at every clip I've just shared, Zubimendi and Calafiori are almost 10 yards apart. And Declan Rice is actually the one that's been given more freedom in this movement. And Eze drops in behind them as the ball goes, and he comes into midfield. So how important do you think that relationship and the introduction of Zubimendi's been to Calafiori? Because there is quite clearly a very, very quickly building relationship there. And the fact that Zubimendi is so good off both feet and Calafiori also is really allows the two of them to link up.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship that they have, even directly on the pitch, is so clear to see. I think similar to Rice and Zubimendi, they are as well. They're playing with their distances and their angles. I spoke about that sort of breaker that Zubimendi has to Calafiori moving onto it diagonally from left to right is one of those connections that we've seen. But they're always looking out for each other. I think they play on a similar wavelength, and I think for upping that, chaos isn't quite the right word. We've spoken about risk already, but upping that and just having the platforming the players to do that and the importance of who is on the pitch. Calafiori and Zubimendi, I would go as far as to say they are probably the most important in terms of upping the risk tolerance of the team without Arteta doing anything himself. I would say so many of the times when you see us, it might be sort of on an audacious pass that Zubimendi or Calafiori make, or they try and go on a dribble. The ball is actually lost, but then we're swarming, we're winning the ball back, and then suddenly, as is one of our strengths, the counter press, we win the ball back, and suddenly the pitch looks much more open. And I think that's a reminder for people for how ball losses, especially when you're a side like Arsenal who are so strong in the counter press, have such incredible athletes trying to regain the ball, but also in rest defense, how those ball losses can actually be rather productive, and how losing the ball more, I think, this season for Arsenal, it sounds, contradictory, but it's been a real positive for us. And Calafiori and Zubimendi feel the charges for that. And wherever they are on the pitch, they feel like the players that are giving this team light and energy, and I think clarity in their ideas at the moment with each other. And I mean, I've probably waxed lyrical enough about Zubimendi on my own channel, but similar to Calafiori, Zubimendi is organising us. If you watch him, he's organising us when we have possession without actually touching the ball. Whether it's how he plays in the cover shadows to draw markers away and open up lanes for others, open up lanes for Calafiori to arrive into. They're sort of those Siamese twins working like that. They're sort of chaos twins. So their relationship is really important, and it's one that has not taken any time whatsoever to strike up. So yeah, absolutely in love with how they're sort of moving and interacting with each other. Yeah.
Yeah, and just like you, I have done a lot on Zubimendi. I did a show on him last week, and I followed it up by another show, and a large part of that ended up being about Zubimendi. I love this player. He's one of my favorite players to watch. I watched the Spain game on Saturday night just to watch Zubimendi, and he's been a breath of fresh air. But you mentioned counter pressing, and I wanted to bring focus to Calafiori's goal against United, because what many will probably have overlooked is Calafiori is so important before the corner. And the goal obviously got the focus. But what actually started here was, you mentioned us losing the ball, and it's an interesting point. So right before I've clipped it, the previous motion is Calafiori taking a quick throw, and the ball goes out of play. He gets further up the park. So it's that willingness. And I mentioned his ability to go and fill the game, what's needed. At the time, it felt like we needed something quick. United had been on the front foot for 10 minutes. We hadn't quite got into the game. Takes a quick throw, goes out of play, wins another one. And then he takes that ball, obviously goes to Declan Rice, and you can see his movement. Gets the ball, and this is what's really interesting. The cross doesn't really go anywhere. It's not great, but straight back in on the counter press, gets the ball to Odegaard. Next minute, corner, ball's in the back of the net. And all that was because of Calafiori. You look at all those actions down that side, it's his quick throw, gets another one. He takes another quick throw. Then he gets the ball into the box, then counter pressing aggressively as well. And I said to you right before we started recording, what I really loved about this, the actual counter press itself kind of summed up very well who Calafiori is because of where he is. You look at him right before, he's off the pitch. And again, we talk about chaos or risk or whatever you want to call it. But the fact he's off the pitch and he's still so switched on, the United players are in dreamland here. And Calafiori is just ready to charge in against United. Because so how much do you think these things, like his ability, I talk about the front-footed play, but that's very much what counter-pressing is. It's being proactive, being front-footed, and him and Zubimendi are so good at it. Then you add in everyone else we've got. But you mentioned the light. I think that's a great description of they're adding light to our team from that area of the pitch. So where do you think we go from here? Because that is the big thing. We're seeing these relationships build, but it's very early on, and that's what's really exciting.
Yeah, I think actually that example against Manchester United is really an interesting one, because if you see the cross that we were speaking about that came in and it was sort of neither here or there, it's one of those areas that Calafiori himself can really improve on the ball. We've spoken a lot about the debate of him defensively and how it's more the timing and the angles of his approach that he can improve on. But on the ball, the crossing element is a big thing, but it's not just as broad as crossing, it's more nuanced than that. I think striking the ball on the move is something that he can improve on, because we can say as a team we want to see a bit more bravery, a bit more risk from the players now that they're sort of on the pitch. But there's sort of the 50-50. There's the flip side of that, which, as we saw against City, it's him on the overlap, smelling that overlap, timing it well, and he puts a cross in from an area where we're not really set in the box. There's not too much risk. There's quite a lot of risk. There's not too much chance of it bobbling nicely for us in the box. It settles in sort of zone 14 and City break, and that's where the Haaland goal comes from. So that's the sort of flip side. And I think if you're actually directly comparing a Hincapié to a Calafiori, that striking the ball on the move is, I think, offensively, in terms of technique on the ball, probably the biggest point of difference between them. I think Calafiori, we can start to rest him a lot more with that Nketiah addition and be more selective with the type of environment he plays. The same goes for Lewis-Skelly, because we're talking about Lewis-Skelly. Where does his dynamism come from? That comes from receiving the ball. Whether, as we've said, Calafiori, it's more the roaming and quantity of movements off it and creating his own momentum. Nketiah is that more shuttle runner up and down the flank. He's going to do a lot more things similar to Calafiori than a Lewis-Skelly, but I think in terms of going forward, I think we have the options to be more selective with giving Calafiori a rest, but also the types of environments and games that we want him playing. I think it was always, to go back to the counter pressing, I think it's always so obvious that Gabriel Heinze, our new assistant coach, was going to absolutely adore Calafiori. I found a video of Heinze, I think when he was in Argentina just before the COVID period coaching, and he was talking about how as risk as a concept in football, he was saying how if you are the superior side, then you can actually use risk as a way to assert your superiority more, because in playing an ambitious pass, for example, like Calafiori tries with the cross, all you're actually doing, if you are truly the better side, like we all believe Arsenal are in most games, then all you're doing is opening up more possibilities for you to show yourself, show the other team that you are the better side. And I think Calafiori this year has just been our toggle, along with Zubimendi, for those more calculated risks. And I think it's difficult to say and to measure the impact of someone like a Heinze on the counter pressing that we're seeing, the different types of intent and urgency that we're seeing, I would say, on the ball this year. But Calafiori doesn't just feel like, okay, it's a Calafiori coming in from last season. It feels like a duo being introduced as a new signing alongside Heinze. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it in terms of what Heinze as a coach has, although it's never going to be known and measurable what he's given, but Calafiori feels like a nice analog, or at least a proxy, for the kinds of ideas that Heinze is trying to supplement and complement this Arteta Arsenal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really fascinating, some of the things that I've seen from Heinze. And I remember him as a player. He was a great crosser of a ball, great getting up and down, and almost similar to Calafiori in the sense that he originally was a centre back. When he moved to United, became a left back and was built like a centre back throughout his career. So same when he went to Madrid, very, very effective player. And I completely agree in that. You mentioned if you're truly better than the opposition, playing against a block wears a team down in terms of it's very repetitive and so on. But if you lose the ball every time you win it, that wears you down 10 times faster. And I think that risk really opens it up. But my final question, just before we finish, is Declan Rice. He described himself after the England game as a box-to-box 8 now. And I think that's very important, because you mentioned him dropping in and covering for Calafiori. We've also seen the introduction of big
It's
switches for the
interesting.
first
I think
time
it's
in
a
a
really
while
good
that we've
point that you
seen in
mentioned
Arsenal.
that,
I
because
mentioned we're sixth
there was
for
a lot
long
of
passes in
talk
the league.
before the
We've seen Eze
season
drop
of
into that
how
left back position, and a big
Rice would
part of
help
that's
get
the
the
freedom
best
with
out of Zubimendi.
Calafiori. But
Zubimendi would help get the
with
best out of
Declan Rice
Rice.
and that
But I
relationship
think
in the midfield,
Calafiori
how
is
much do you think
helping
his
get the
role is
best out of all of
benefiting
them.
Calafiori,
And I
and
think it
likewise
goes obviously
Calafiori is allowing
both
Declan
ways.
Rice to do
I
Declan Rice
think
things?
the reason why Calafiori and Rice pop a little bit more is not just because they're constantly rotating with each other. I think it's just where you want players threatening. Rice, when he is doing, as probably one of the more frustrating things that we've seen in his usage previously, when he has been playing that higher role as an interior, he's been doing a lot. He's been doing too much pinning, I think, for all of our liking. Whereas if you can get him to arrive a bit higher, and both him and Calafiori are brilliant at those sort of barreling, stampeding underlaps that are really sort of hard to contend. They often have opposition wingers trying to track them and sort of missing a step on them. And I think that ability to move in and out with each other much more dynamically, I think previously when Deck has come low, and maybe with Calafiori in those higher pockets, there's much more of a balance to our play, quite clearly. And they can do a lot of each other's things. I think they're not just two completely different profiles. They complement the team in actually very similar ways. And you're seeing, I mean, I go back probably to the Leicester. Do you remember the 4-2 against Leicester last season? That felt like, I mean, that was the first time we had used Timber and Calafiori as fullbacks, as the sort of here, there, and everywhere players that Arteta was introducing, and it was the first time we saw them as a pair of sort of total footballers, and that almost sold us a bit of a dream of what we'd wanted to see more of if availability and injuries went one way. And the way we're seeing it now, I think Declan Rice is a better player with how the team is set up at the moment with Calafiori on the pitch. But lots of things can happen. Lots of things will continue to evolve. Lots of the things we're seeing on the pitch this season will have been things Arteta wouldn't have even expected himself, I think, a few years ago. So things can evolve, things can change. We could be looking at next season, Rice in a completely different role again, for example. We could be sitting here in 2 years' time with Calafiori in a much different role, doing the same sort of thing, but from a left centre-back, for example. So, yeah, there's lots of things to keep an eye on, but I think for the meantime, it's just important that these relationships are getting the best out of each other. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great place to leave it because the team is quite clearly evolving. There's going to be a lot more to discuss as this season goes on. And I think it's fascinating what we're seeing right now. It's such an exciting time to support the team. And Calafiori in particular is a player that I think we could both talk about all day. But Harvey, huge thanks for coming on the show. Could you please tell everyone where they can find you?
Yeah, my YouTube channel, simple, Harvey Gratian. If you like what you heard, then it'd be great to check me out. But thank you so much, Adam. If you haven't already, subscribe to Arsenal Therapy, of course. But thank you so much for having me on. I hope to get you on my channel soon, or we can just do this again on yours.
Yeah, I'd love to come on. So yeah, big thanks. And I'd highly recommend anyone watches Harvey's channel. I would say make sure you've got a bit of time because you will want to take in what he's showing on the screen as well. But yeah, massive thanks. And if you've liked, if you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Please drop us a comment. Let's have a conversation. Thank you guys. We'll see you again very soon.
You're now listening to the Arsenal Therapy Podcast.